at 1-866-229-3239, option 1. Now I would like to introduce our first presenter for today, Mindy Scott. Mindy is a senior research scientist at Child Trends, a nonprofit research organization focused exclusively on improving the lives of children and youth. Dr. Scott conducts research on youth and adult healthy relationships, family formation, and fatherhood, with a specific focus on supporting programs and policies for families.
Great, thanks so much, Megan, and hello, everybody. I'm Mindy Scott, and I just wanted to quickly welcome you all and to get us started by providing a bit of background on the Marriage Strengthening Research and Dissemination Center, or MAST Center for short, and the center is hosting today's webinar. The MAST Center was established in 2018 and is made up of a team of national experts in marriage and relationship research and practice. The center is led by Child Trends in partnership with Public Strategies and the National Center for Family and Marriage Research at Bowling Green State University. Our center, let me go back to that last slide. But just a little bit more on the center. We conduct research on marriage and romantic relationships and on the programs designed to strengthen those relationships. And really this work is intended to help identify critical research gaps, generate new knowledge, and help programs more effectively serve individuals and families that they work with. The center also focuses on mentoring and supporting emerging scholars, including students and early career professionals, to help expand and strengthen the field of researchers studying relationships and families. And I encourage everybody to check out our MAST Center website, mastresearchcenter.org. The website has more information about the center, the team, and access to a number of research and capacity building resources, including resources for emerging scholars. Next slide. As part of that capacity building work that the MAST Center does, we are presenting a series of 3 webinars. These are all focused on researcher-practitioner relationships and conversations that can really help build and support productive partnerships throughout program implementation and evaluation. Today's webinar is the second in that series, and we'll be focusing on conversations during the implementation stages of evaluation. The first webinar focused more on conversations during evaluation planning and in the early stages of evaluation. And then our third webinar will address conversations around disseminating program evaluation findings. And the slides and recordings for the 3 webinars will be available on that MAST Center website. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more on the purpose for today's webinar. We'll focus on the types and timing of conversations needed during program implementation to help ensure evaluation methods align with program components and the flow of programming as implementation begins. It's really common for things to change between planning, both for the program and evaluation, and when implementation starts, and then also throughout implementation. And so having continued conversations can really help to ensure that evaluators and practitioners are talking and making decisions together and staying on the same page. Conversations can also help to identify opportunities for using evaluation data to feed back into programming, and then also to use program data to help inform the evaluation. And given how central many issues are right now for programs and evaluators related to virtual programming, we'll include some discussion and examples of conversations and potential challenges related to implementing and evaluating programs during a pandemic like COVID-19, and just program delivery and evaluation in a virtual world more generally. So Megan will introduce the rest of our speakers for today, who will guide you through these valuable conversations.
Thank you, Mindy. So the first presenter I would like to introduce today is Mindy Hermanstall. Mindy is a research psychologist with more than 20 years of experience designing and evaluating programs for youth, families, and communities. She has conducted program evaluations for numerous organizations, including the Administration for Children and Families, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the Office of Minority Health. She also has partnered with states and tribal nations to conduct needs assessments and evaluate evidence-based public health programs. Our next presenter is Lauren Maddox. Lauren co-leads capacity building activities for the MAST Center. She has worked in the healthy marriage and responsible fatherhood field for 13 years, developing and coordinating family strengthening programs, providing customized training and technical assistance to federal grantees, state and federal organizations, and collaborating with research firms on large-scale evaluations. She is a project manager with Public Strategies and brings a practitioner perspective to the project with expertise in development and implementation of outcome-oriented strategies for couples, individuals, and youth. Our next presenter is Ryan Carlson. Ryan is an associate professor at the University of South Carolina and director of the Consortium for Family Strengthening Research. He is the evaluator of an impact evaluation for a current HMRE funded program. And Ryan also has previous programming experience, having served as a project director, workshop facilitator, and a recruiter. Lastly with us today is Nikita Carroll. Nikita is a licensed marriage and family therapist and serves as the Assistant Director of Family Services at the University of Central Florida Marriage and Family Research Institute. In her role, Nikita provides supervision and guidance to implementation staff members. The Institute's current project, Project Harmony, is the second grant-funded project with which Nikita has been a part. Thank you to all of our presenters for being here today, and we look forward to hearing from you. Now I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter for today, Mindy Herman-Stahl.
Thank you, Megan. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm Mindy Herman-Stahl from Public Strategies. I'm excited to be here with you again today for part 2 of our webinar series on researcher-practitioner conversations, a topic I think is really important but often overlooked in program evaluation webinars and trainings. So today we're not going to talk about the mechanics of program evaluation, but I did want to give a quick definition of how we are defining it. Program evaluation is a systematic method for collecting, analyzing, and using information to answer questions about program implementation and effectiveness. And today when we give some examples and go over some discussions about evaluation implementation, we will include both process and outcome assessment. And as the other Mindy said, our MAST Center focuses on marriage and healthy relationships, and so many of our discussions or examples may include evaluation questions within this context, but we believe the content we'll be discussing is applicable across different substantive areas. So in any partnership, people bring different perspectives and strengths into the relationship. And this is true in practitioner-evaluator partnerships as well. And these differences make a collaborative approach the best way to conduct program evaluation. But there can be misunderstandings if expectations and priorities are not clear and practitioners and evaluators don't understand each other's point of view. So on this slide, we show a scale of evaluation priorities on the left side and service delivery priorities on the right side. And here I am speaking in very broad brushed strokes, but generally evaluators are trained to prioritize scientific rigor, technical complexity, taking a slow and methodical approach to collecting data, and collecting lots of data if there's a lot of different hypotheses to answer. And not on the opposite spectrum, but sort of along the continuum, service delivery priorities may differ in that the focus is on feasibility, user-friendliness, timely service to all, a rapid need for data, and reducing participant burden in evaluations. So it's not an either-or situation. Of course, program evaluators care about feasibility and usefulness. But as mentioned, they are trained to select evaluation designs with the most scientific rigor, like a randomized controlled trial, which is not always realistic in a field setting. And of course, practitioners want evaluations to be valid and careful, but they also need data early in the evaluation process to improve recruitment and attendance and to show their stakeholders the value of participating in evaluation. Lauren, I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about how messaging stakeholders needs to take into account different values and priorities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mindy. So continuing in the same vein of communication, let's spend a few minutes thinking about how you message your evaluation and program to key stakeholders. Messaging your evaluation to stakeholders can be tricky, but it's so important to its success. The messaging that you create can make or break the buy-in for the evaluation process. Each stakeholder, whether that is staff, participants, or program partners, have their own interests, their own values, and their own level of understanding when it comes to evaluation. And working with them to build rapport is pivotal to how successful programs create outcomes. Overall, people need to feel solidarity with your program and understand that we are all in this together, not that you're the expert talking at them. So to do this well, we need to gain buy-in to the evaluation process by creating messages that speak to and connect with your intended audience. So on this slide, you will see some best practices to creating messages that connect. You can use the rules outlined here to create many types of messages, such as marketing messages or recruitment pitches. But for today, we will think about this in the context of messaging your evaluation to stakeholders. So let's discuss a few things to consider when creating messages that connect. So these messages will be personal and relevant to the intended audience. They'll show respect and communicate the benefits of the evaluation to the audience. They'll offer them something they need and or value. And if working with a community partner organization, these messages need to align with their mission and goals. And they're going to use terms and language that they understand. So a big picture caution for both verbal and written communication is to be careful not to use language that can turn people off because it sounds too heady or doesn't connect with their needs. So a good reminder, especially when communicating with participants, is to use people speak and not program or evaluation speak. So we encourage you to work with your evaluator and program staff to create these messages that connect with each intended audience. Once you have crafted your evaluation messages for each audience to gain buy-in, it is important to create a communication and engagement plan appropriate for each stakeholder's role. This is going to ensure that they continue to buy into the program and the evaluation. So think about how often you will communicate and with what method. What information will you share with internal staff, external stakeholders, and participants? And what meetings or processes will they regularly take part in? So now we are going to turn over to Ryan and Nikita. They are our researcher and practitioner team, and we are so excited to have them joining us on this webinar today. And we have a couple of questions that we'd like to pose to you. So how have you created messaging around evaluation for staff, participants, and other stakeholders to get buy-in?
Sure. Well, I think as an evaluator, there were, especially early on in the development of the project, in the initial rollout of the project, we were intentional about me presenting to the program team what the evaluation would look like, what components we were evaluating. But I think I learned some lessons the hard way in terms of presenting to the audience, because it's easy from an evaluation perspective to really get bogged down in the methods, to get bogged down in jargony language. And so it was important for me to revise the way that I talk about the evaluation, and also challenging to think about it from that perspective. But to talk about messaging by stating things like, our goal is to determine if this works and who it works for. And one of the reasons why we're setting up the evaluation this way is because we want to be able to continue to justify and support getting this program out to others. And we can do that by showing that it works and who it works for. Another example is that when we were setting up the kind of the logistics of of how the evaluation would work, and our particular evaluation is a randomized controlled trial, we tried to think about the experience of the participants. And in previous projects, whenever participants from the community would hear terms like research study, they would often say things like, so I'm just going to be a number, so I'm just data. And so we tried to be considerate of those experiences for them. And so even through the process of enrollment, we talked about things like you can get selected for program A versus program B, rather than saying you're randomized to the treatment group versus the waitlist control group. And when the selection process occurred, it was almost celebratory, like, congratulations, you're getting program A, or congratulations, you're getting program B. So we tried to make it something that was sort of fun for them, as opposed to part of the research process.
Yeah, I think along those lines, I know we intentionally, in every instance of speaking with participants about the assessments, we would use the term questionnaires because we felt it was a less technical term with which they may have been more familiar. And then we also, to create buy-in at the intake that we would host, which were group intake, we would intentionally thank them for the time that they were taking to help us find a way to help other families. And so, again, encouraging them and helping them see the way that they were impacting the community as a whole.
That's great. Great advice on how to message that to staff, participants, and stakeholders. So let's talk a little bit about how you have handled differences in viewpoints when making major evaluation decisions.
Yeah, we really believe in the idea that we should practice what we preach. And so one of the things that we embraced as a team is using active listening skills. So when we're talking about ideas that people have, whether it's on the research side or the implementation side, we often feel passionate about the reasons why we have these ideas. And so when there's different perspectives or opinions, it was really helpful and has been helpful to use active listening skills to try to listen to understand, particularly for me, to listen to understand for each of the implementation team, the program team's roles, what it would be like to try to carry out some of the things that we are asking them to do from an evaluation perspective. And then once we feel like we had shared meaning, we could collaboratively come up with a solution. And that collaborative solution hopefully was something that worked for everybody involved. When thinking about this question, there's an example that comes to mind for me, and it has to do with recruitment. Oftentimes, recruiters are going out into the community, and and good recruiters too. They have this mindset that I want to let everybody know about these services. These are, it's a great opportunity. We know people can benefit from participating, so I want everybody to have the chance to benefit. When doing a rigorous evaluation, like a randomized controlled trial, one of the things that we have to consider is response rate. So it's not just getting people to enroll, but we want people to enroll and to be able to actually stay in the project, in the study over time. And so early on, we had a lot of conversations about quality versus quantity with respect to referrals and what that looked like. And we talked about an equation that we used in other projects called, and the equation is A plus E equals R. So availability plus eligibility equals a referral. So it's not just that somebody was interested and excited and eligible to participate, but that they also thought they were available to attend various aspects of the study. Of course, things come up, unexpected things come up, particularly when we're talking about delivering services for people who may not have access to a lot of resources and things of that nature. But it's at least about having the conversation that, hey, this is a commitment that we're asking you to make as well. And so we had back and forth dialogue about what it would actually look like for the recruitment team to embrace this mindset.
Yeah, that's in line with how I experienced our discussions around difficult subjects as well. There's often this conversation about the balance of research and implementation, and I think that it then transferred through the decisions that we made. So I think we worked really hard at being open to all perspectives and then trying to make that joint decision.
Thank you both. Yeah, some really great takeaways from that discussion or conversation. Some key things that I took away that, when making decisions, using active listening skills, coming to a shared meaning or understanding, and then having a collaborative solution. I love that. That's a really great formula for success. And then I really like that equation for recruitment, that A plus E equals R, so we have availability plus eligibility equals a referral. So those are some really good nuggets of information, and I appreciate you contributing to that. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Mindy, and she is going to walk us through some potential challenges and measures.
Thanks, Lauren. And Ryan and Nikita, that was a good segue into what I'll be talking about, which is the types of conversations that are needed around implementation. So in our first webinar, we talked about program evaluation decisions relating to planning. And in this webinar, we're focused more on the implementation issues. So to maintain a high quality evaluation, it's not like you can make program evaluation decisions at the onset and then the conversations are over. Communication is needed throughout the program implementation, as Ryan and Nikita just demonstrated, to address how the evaluation designs are playing out in real time. So this graphic shows a continuum of communication about evaluation components from planning to implementation. So for example, questions about sampling in the planning phase may relate to targeted recruitment goals. During planning, the evaluator will probably conduct some power analyses to see if the expected sample size will be large enough to detect statistically significant effects. During implementation, questions around sampling may be related to recruitment and participation rates. Does it look like the program is on track to recruit the expected target population? If not, why? Is it that the program can't find individuals or couples who meet the criteria? Is it because people can't attend workshops because they're held during the day and they have jobs? It's important for the practitioner and the evaluators to put their heads together over issues like this and see how process data can be used to improve recruitment before it's too late. By the way, if you have any questions or examples, talking to everybody who's listening right now, about practitioner-evaluator conversations that are needed in measurements and instruments and tools that you've experienced, feel free to write them in the chat box, or if you have any questions on this topic, feel free to write them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them later when we have our question and answer period near the end of the webinar. So, next slide. So mapping goals, activities, and measures is another really important conversation to have around evaluation implementation. It's really important that the activities align with the measurement plan. In the first webinar, we talked about this with relation to logic models and theory of change. So there are three major pieces to alignment: the program aims, the activities, and the evaluation measurement. What does our program hope to accomplish? How will we accomplish these goals? And how will we be able to show our stakeholders through the evaluation data that our program is having the intended effect? One helpful way to think about it is to lay it out like this. For example, you can see in the first row, first column, one aim of this program is to increase communication among couples who are enrolled in a relationship education course. The program is using a curriculum that has activities in sessions 2 and 4 that are again reinforced in sessions 10 through 12, to see if, and these changes are measured through the couple communication satisfaction scale in the evaluation. So here everything aligns. We have a goal, we have activities that match the purpose of the goal, and the measures capture the appropriate types of information. But alternatively, if you look at rows 2 and 5, we have missing data in the cells. In row 2, the program is designed to reduce couple conflict, and there are activities that relate to teaching couples about how to reduce conflict, but there's no items in the questionnaire that measure this. So there won't be any empirical data to show any effects. There's also misalignment in row 5, where a program desires to increase parenting skills. The parenting skills are measured using a parenting and family adjustment scale, but there actually are no activities that are designed to improve parenting behaviors. So it's unlikely that the program will show any impacts in this area. Ryan and Nicole, I'd love to get your input. What kinds of conversation about measuring program process and effects have arisen for you during program implementation?
So we had conversations about very broad aspects of measurement down to very specific ones having to do with our target population. In the early stages, we had conversations about how often we should measure and at which time point. And we discussed the details of if we are assessing face-to-face, what we're tying the assessment point to so that participants show and we can capture the data. We had to consider how we were going to assess people, and so we ended up deciding to have people complete the assessments using iPads, and then that led to discussions that had us question, well, what do we do in the instance that we experience technology issues? And so we unfortunately had opportunities where that was the case, and after they happened, then we would have conversations about, okay, how well is the plan that we have in place, and how do we, in the best way, incorporate the data into the electronic system. And then when I think about over the course of the evaluation, we've considered the influence the structure of the program events may have. So for example, we collected data at 30, 90, and 100 days after participants completed the intake, and that we were able to see that at the 90-day time point, there was a significant difference between the two groups, and so we were able to talk through those things. And then finally, I think of the conversations that came up because we offer our services both in English and Spanish, and so talks around how we can make sure that we had all of the assessments available in Spanish, and then the fact that there are several dialects that are a part of the Spanish language in itself. And so there are lots of conversations along those lines as well.
Yeah, I think feasibility of delivering the assessments, not just what the assessments were asking and the constructs that they were measuring, but feasibility was important to us from a logistical perspective. And one of the things that was helpful was that we had all of the program staff complete the battery of assessments so that they felt like that, they had a good understanding of what it was we were asking participants to do. And then based on that, we were able to make some revisions. But we wanted the questions to be clear and feasible to deliver to participants.
Sounds like you must have each other on speed dial. Sounds like a lot of conversations were needed, which is great.
Yeah, there were a lot of conversations back and forth and a lot of feedback back and forth. And so I think it's important as a counselor, and I know Nikita does as well, we kind of embrace a systemic way of thinking, which really promotes this idea of bi-directional feedback. And that's a type of relationship that we engage in from an evaluator to program team as well.
And I'm sure that care has come across in the quality of your evaluations as well. So given we're in crazy times with a lot going on outside of programs, I'm wondering if you have any tips for measuring context events outside of programs that could impact program effectiveness, like pandemics, natural disasters, school closures, job loss, etc.
I think this is really important because for the types of folks that we're wanting to participate in these interventions, these are the types of things that I think come up that can really impact the ability for people to continue attending. So, you know, obviously there are events that are more obvious, going to have more of an obvious impact than other events, such as the global pandemic. But even in more of a typical year, it can be helpful to look at trends in the data. So enrollment trends by month, and looking at peaks and valleys and what might be going on during the months where there's a spike in enrollment versus the times where there's a valley in enrollment. For example, around the holidays is a time period where we often experienced a decrease in enrollment because people are sort of, you know, planning for the holidays. So programmatically, what can be done to add some more opportunities for enrollment just before or just after that to sort of make up for that time period. Another thing that we did that was helpful was we conducted some focus groups with people who had already been through the program just to get their perspective on the enrollment process, the quality of the services, but they were able to help us understand how outside events play a role and influence their overall participation, like how having a sick child can, especially if you don't have a lot of resources or family support to help you with childcare, how that can influence them, or if there's an opportunity to work overtime, how working overtime obviously can take precedence over participating in the project. And so it really helped us to understand those types of contextual stressors that participants might be facing.
Well, thanks. As the new grantees start in the fiscal year, I think there'll be a lot of contextual events to keep track of. So, similar to what we just talked about regarding measures, there are decisions that need to be made up front during evaluation planning about data collection. And you talked about this in your examples as well, about deciding to use the iPads and having issues with technology. So in the early phases, you think about who will collect the data, what data will they collect, who will be respondents, will the data be qualitative or quantitative? But during implementation, it's important for the practitioner and evaluators to check in regarding how early decisions are playing out in the field. Are adjustments in data collection needed? Is data collection too much of a burden? What barriers are interfering with data collection? Continued conversations are needed to ensure that the evaluation gets enough data, the right data, and accurate data to be effective. So again, everybody who's listening, if you have any examples of issues that have come up for you during implementation relating to methods or any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box and we'll try to discuss them at the Q&A. So Ryan and Nikita, I'd love to get more examples from you all about issues that have arisen that have required conversations around collecting data. I know you've mentioned iPads and the technology and trying the instruments on the staffing to make sure that they were feasible. Those are all great points.
Sure. One specifically significant discussion we had was about the order of events and assessments at our group intake. When we first began the program, we would have participants sign in, do a review of the informed consent, and they would immediately be assigned an iPad for the event and then start on their assessment. As a part of the incentive structure, we also served a meal, which was usually dinner because most of our workshops happened in the evening time. So usually dinner. after the assessments were collected. So what ended up happening was that it created a very uncomfortable environment for the participants who took a little longer to complete the assessment. So there was a concern that they perhaps felt pressure to rush through the assessment. So we discussed it and decided to actually flip the order in which we held the intake. And so we began to start the workshops with welcoming them in, offering them dinner, allowing them to sit down, touch base with other participants or oftentimes their partner that they hadn't seen since the beginning of their day. And then we reviewed the informed consent, did a really thorough overview of the program, followed by assigning them their iPad for the evening. And then they were able to finish the assessments. And then as they finished them, as a couple, they could be randomly assigned, and then they could leave at their own pace. It really made a big difference, and it truly aligned a lot better with the experience we wanted to provide as well. And so that was a pretty significant change that came about from a discussion of seeing what was happening. Another example that comes to mind that required a conversation was a time that those of us who were implementing makeup workshops when a participant missed their group workshop didn't expect to have shared meetings with the evaluation team and their plan. And so, as I explained earlier, we collect data at the intake, 30, 90, and 100 days out from that point. And the intent was for data to be collected within these windows. So the idea was that there would be 15-day windows at 30 and 90 days where they would take the assessments again from 30 to 45 days or 90 to 105 days after their initial assessment at intake. However, the interpretation became 15 days, a 15-day window after their event, which may or may not have been within that same 15-day window that the evaluation team described. So we were able to discuss it and come up with a plan and how to move forward. And it ended up being resolved, and we were able to move forward. Considering that kind of same idea about these windows, as Ryan mentioned about holidays, there were times where someone's trajectory, right, on their course through the program, their 90-day or perhaps their 30-day will fall within those windows, where with holidays we were operating in the context and environment of a university system where you get, a big amount of time off around the holidays usually. And so having discussions around like how we handle those things as well. I don't know if there are other things that come to mind too.
I think those are great examples because they represent a lot of the very nuanced decisions that have to be made when these things are being implemented on the ground. We had a lot of conversations around if we're going to assess people at these various time points, how are we going to get them back in to come and complete these questionnaires? Because just asking them to come and complete some questionnaires probably isn't going to be enough. It's not going to do the trick. It's not somebody who is driving. Orlando is a very sprawling urban area. And so somebody from the opposite side of town, it could take them over an hour to get to UCF where the services were being delivered. And so we had to think through those types of scenarios. But I also appreciate the example Nikita shared about having to flip the order of when we asked participants questions or to complete questionnaires during the initial enrollment or intake process, because we didn't want participants to feel like they were, we were just about the data. We wanted to create a positive, relational, warm experience for them. And we were realizing that the way that we had it set up initially was not doing that. It was creating more stress for them. And so by adjusting the order, we were able to sort of decrease some of the stress give people more of an opportunity to take longer if they needed to take longer. And so I think that also results in better quality evaluation data as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So two things that come to mind, your examples just show how dynamic evaluation and programming is. It's not like it's a static thing where you have a plan and you talk about it, and then 5 years later you call each other up and say, here's the results. You really have to be on the ball and be looking at everything that's going on as it plays out, which brings me to my second point about the observation that you made during the dinner, which I know I'm really grumpy if I don't have my food first. So I definitely think having a dinner first is a good plan. I mean, that not only was that communication, but that was a lot of observations and thinking through in the moment what's going on. So now with the challenge of virtual programming and data collection that we might have and continue to have with COVID, do you have any tips for handling virtual data collection?
Yeah, so some things we think are important with respect to virtual data collection are to keep it simple. The pandemic has been stressful for people in different ways, but sometimes when we're asked to do things electronically that are time-consuming and might be foreign to us, that also creates some anxiety and stress. So keeping data collection as concise as possible, I think virtually would be helpful. Keeping in mind that some questions that we're asking people to respond to can be sensitive in nature. And when they're in front of us, we have a better opportunity to sort of control who around them might be looking at their responses. But when they're not in front of us and they're at home, we have no control over their ability to safely respond to sensitive questions. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the types of questions we're asking them virtually. Also think it's important to keep in mind that some people's only access to the internet is through their cell phone. And so, and even if it's not, just out of convenience, many people might complete virtual questionnaires via their cell phone. And so it would be important to have have a mobile-friendly app or web-based platform that makes it easy for people to respond to questions on a cell phone.
I think the only thing that I would add is to really consider resources on both ends. So the resources, which is what Ryan just alluded to, right, that your participants may have to access the assessments, and also your team's resources and manpower to be able to administer the assessments. And so, as I mentioned earlier, at first the participants would come in and they would take the assessments on the iPad. And at first we didn't have the permission to have them do the assessments on their own. And so there was a need for us to be able to verbally complete the assessments with participants over the phone, which took a lot of time and manpower. So I would also encourage people to consider their resources as well.
One thing I would add too is that it really takes a lot of clear communication and instructions to help participants understand how they're supposed to complete information virtually. And Nikita, I know you spent a lot of time trying to make sure that the instructions that we were providing to participants made sense. You know, what is a participant ID and where do they enter it and how do they move through the links, getting feedback from other people to help make sure that that's clear as well.
Yes, I think we believe that we're more clear than we actually are. And for a little while there was a puzzle of some things not lining up, and we were able to eventually figure out, like, we're not being as clear as we need to be. And so there's a lot that's lost in translation when you move to not being face-to-face, for sure.
So a lot of additional complexities for handling virtual data collection. Lauren, now I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about how we can use evaluation data early on in the process through customer journey mapping and continuous quality improvement.
Great, thank you, Mindy. And thank you, Brian and Nikita. Your answers and responses were a great segue into what we're going to talk about next, which is customer journey mapping. So your program may want to consider using customer journey mapping as a tool to gather data and identify participant pain points during implementation to ensure a smooth process and participant experience. There are many benefits to engaging in customer journey mapping, including identifying where participants are being confused or feeling the process is too impersonal, identifying problems where the process breaks down, planning for an efficient participant experience, and possibly reducing duplication and shortening processes, and targeting limited resources for maximum impact. So a couple of the examples that Ryan and Nikita gave, really they were doing customer journey mapping. They were thinking about the customer or the participant's experience with that intake process and found that really they need to come in, they need to fill their bellies with some food, they need to get comfortable with the environment before they engage with that intake process. So thinking about how the participant is feeling, that's all plays into that customer journey mapping. So before we discuss the steps of customer journey mapping, we need to understand that there are moments of truth or critical moments in a participant's journey throughout your program. So these are emotionally charged interactions that either make or break your relationship. So a first moment of truth could be when a participant enrolls in your program or at that initial intake. A second moment of truth could be taking an entrance survey as a part of your evaluation. So because these are pivotal moments of truth in a participant's program journey, it is important to get them right. So now let's talk about some steps you can take to conduct your own customer journey mapping. And those steps are outlined on this slide. So step one, we're going to create a persona. So whose journey will you map? A persona is a compilation of common participant characteristics and a representation of your typical client or participant. Step two, you're going to map your touch points. What activities will you map? What level of detail will you include? So what are those moments of truth in your program? And step three, you're going to attach participant thoughts. What is your customer thinking at this touch point? And step four, you're going to think about their emotional responses. What is the customer feeling at each touch point? The next step after creating your customer journey map is to identify the pain points in their program journey. So for each pain point you identify, there's a set of questions that are helpful to ask. Did we lose participants because of this step? Do participants lose motivation during this step? Does this pain point cost us performance and success with the participant? And lastly, what data can we track to monitor improvements with this pain point? So customer journey mapping is a powerful tool that you can use to take a walk in your participant's shoes, to feel what they feel, and to make adjustments when things don't feel right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about continuous quality improvement. So this is a complementary way to use program data to improve evaluation. And it's a great way. CQI, Continuous Quality Improvement, or CQI, is a management philosophy that organizations use to increase efficiency and increase internal and external satisfaction. So it is an ongoing process that provides structure to engage in conversations with your evaluator and program staff, identify and analyze strengths and problems, and implement testing and revise solutions as needed. So there's a couple of things to consider about CQI. One is it requires planning. So whether you are just getting started or have been doing it for a while, You need to account for that planning. Everyone has a role. So leadership, program staff, evaluators, and external stakeholders. It is dependent on the participation of all staff, and it requires commitment and persistence. So let's talk a little bit about some elements of an effective CQI process. An effective CQI process will include identifying areas for improvement and setting goals, developing strategies for improvement, testing the strategies, and assessing improvement. And an important piece of your CQI plan is to establish an implementation team. So the implementation teams include at least 3 to 5 people who are actively and regularly involved in program implementation. Teams typically include a range of staff who have different roles in the program, including your evaluator. Although all staff participate in CQI, the implementation team manages and oversees the process. They meet regularly and frequently and are problem solvers to program implementation challenges. So you'll want to utilize your implementation team to monitor data around identified areas and assess pain points that need to be addressed. So thinking back to the customer journey mapping process, you can use your identified touch points or moments of truth as areas for your implementation team to monitor. And then you're going to use qualitative and quantitative data to track performance. Lastly, it is important to make sure that all staff are informed of the organization's commitment to CQI, understand how they will be involved in CQI, and have opportunities to contribute their ideas, feedback, and recommendations. And so now we're going to pivot back to Ryan and Nikita and ask a few questions about kind of keeping that bi-directional feedback in mind that you were talking about earlier. Can you share some best practices or examples of using evaluation data during program implementation to improve service delivery? Or let's think about the flip side too. What about some examples of using program data to improve evaluation design?
There are some aspects of the evaluation that we set up from the beginning and incorporated within the evaluation to help inform the program. So one example is that we implemented something called intent to attend. Intent to attend is a one question item that we asked participants to respond to at 3 different time points, the first 3 different assessment time points that they were with us. And it simply asks, how likely is it that you are, how likely is it that you will attend your next scheduled workshop? And participants respond on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not at all likely and 5 being highly likely. We were able to take that data and through some statistical processes, look at the predictive ability of partner scores on later attendance in the program. And so we were also able to look at break points or cut points in those scores to see at which points were people more likely to attend versus less likely to attend. And we found that when people indicated anything other than the highest value, so anything lower than a 5, they were much less likely to show up. So programmatically or ideally, from a programmatic perspective, we would have the program team follow up with any person who indicated less than a 5 so that we could proactively address some of the reasons that may be preventing them from following up or coming back. And so there's, one of the things that we realized from that experience as well is that especially with a low-income population, they're not always, even if they intend to come back, they're not always able to predict the things that are going to come up to keep them from coming back. An example that I like to share is that we had one participant who the program team followed up with because they put less than a 5, and their response was, "Oh, well, God willing, I'll be back." So, if it's in God's plan, it was kind of the perspective of, assuming nothing major happens. And so I think that was helpful at gauging the ways that participants were thinking about their attendance. But there are some other things as well. For example, we focus a lot on survey response rates in evaluation. Survey response rates are different than attendance. Survey response rates track the people who respond at the time points where we're giving or administering survey questionnaires. Attendance is when people are attending the various workshop components, and so those two things might not always align. And so we would compare survey response rates and attendance to help us gauge any patterns with program retention and engagement. We would also look at skipped items or any type of missing data to help us understand maybe if there were challenges with one questionnaire over another. And the last example I can think about is, again, related to recruitment. We looked at and categorized the types of recruitment strategies into either active strategies. So these were strategies where the recruitment team or program staff was actively talking to people and signing them up as a potential referral, versus passive strategies where participants were calling in on their own, or maybe they saw a flyer, or maybe there was word of mouth. And so we use those groupings to see if one of those strategies is more effective than another with respect to program retention or engagement.
And when I think about examples for using program data to improve the evaluation design, what comes to mind for me is what we called what happened calls. So when participants would not show for their scheduled workshop, our case coordinators would complete these what happened calls. So it's an opportunity to find out more about the barriers to participation, maybe try to mitigate those barriers if we were able to. And there was a short period of time where we were going a little more in detail about the reasons for missing it. The call was to try to impact retention and data collection. And as Ryan stated, the intent to attend really reaffirmed that things will come up and attrition will happen, and that we can only control so much of that. And so I think that was a valuable takeaway. And then from his speaking earlier, Ryan mentioned watching trends in recruitment and retention, and I think that also taught us a lot about when we schedule events and what to try to avoid as well, as examples.
That's great. Thank you both. I have just a quick follow-up question, Ryan. When tracking active and passive strategies, did you have any significant results on which one is more effective?
Actually, no, we didn't. We didn't see any statistically significant results with respect to which one is more effective, which surprised us because our assumption was that people who call in or attend passively, maybe they have higher levels of motivation to participate, would have higher levels of retention, and that there were no statistically significant differences between those groups.
Very interesting.
From a very practical perspective, it's more cost efficient to have higher levels of passive recruitment strategies because it requires less staff time. We know that with the active strategies, it requires getting more people in your initial pool for those folks to actually end up enrolling. So from that perspective, there is a difference between the two.
Right. Okay, yeah. But I would have thought one would have outweighed the other, but that's interesting that they were kind of level. Yeah. Okay, so we have reached the end of the content portion of our presentation today, and we want to open it up for questions from participants. Questions for the presenters, questions for our researcher-practitioner team. If you want to submit a question, if you will do that in the chat box and make sure to select to everyone, we can be able to see that question. And I know we had one that came in pretty quick, but a participant asked, I'm curious as to the ratio or your ratio of qualitative versus quantitative evaluation questions.
The overwhelming majority are quantitative questions. And so our evaluation is primarily a quantitative methodology. However, we conducted focus groups yearly with both participants and project partners. But overwhelmingly, our evaluation is informed by quantitative questions.
Great. And we had another question. What kind of evaluation challenges have you experienced? And I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, but as a result of COVID-19, and how have you handled these challenges?
I think we were somewhat fortunate with respect to timing because our formal data collection ended April 1st. So when the transition to really COVID programming or pandemic programming occurred, largely our formal evaluation was complete. However, there was still an evaluation that continued largely for federal reporting purposes. So it didn't inform the randomized controlled trial evaluation, but was still informing the federal implementation of the programming. There were a lot of challenges to transitioning from face-to-face services to online services, which I'm sure many people experienced these challenges. Fortunately, we did have, at one point, and I can't remember which grant year it was, we began to implement some online data collection for people who missed an assessment time point, and then they also didn't come in for their makeup session. So then we would send them a link to try to complete the questionnaires, even though they missed 2 appointments. We were able to use some of that groundwork that had already been created to build from with respect to the pandemic programming and evaluation piece.
That's great. Nikita, did you have anything else to add to that question about challenges that you may have experienced as a result of COVID-19 and how you overcame some of those challenges?
Again, I would go back to the experience that we had with the level of clarity, right, that we had. There were challenges that came up that we didn't anticipate because we weren't used to communicating in that way. And so any even narrow adjustments you can make to your process to be as fair as possible would definitely be encouraged.
That's a great point. Okay, so it looks like we have another question that came in. Do you have any tips for maintaining good practitioner-researcher communication, especially if partners are not in the same location?
Yeah, and we're not in the same location. We're a few states away, and so I think communication, as you're mentioning, Lauren, is even more important. So we had standing evaluation calls, and we knew that there was a day and time dedicated for that, and that would be on everyone's calendar. So as questions would come up, they could be sort of set aside, knowing that that opportunity was there. We had those calls more frequently towards the beginning of the project, but then as the project was being rolled out and the cogs started turning, we had them not quite as frequently, but still a few times per month. The other piece is that I would often get emails directly from program staff or phone calls from program staff if questions came up that the program staff felt it was important for the evaluation team to be aware of. And so I think it's really important for the evaluator to be accessible, not to be some name or some person that's sort of out there that the program team doesn't really know about or have access to. So there are lots of valuable conversations that occurred just in being accessible and having fluid communication with the program team.
I think along those same lines, when you talk about being accessible, I thought your site visits were also very helpful. And so there were several times along the way that you flew in to actually speak with the staff to observe what was going on. And I thought that was important. And particularly helpful for me was the Who Decides chart that we created in the beginning, where we sat down ahead of time and said, if this type of scenario occurs, like at what point do we involve, right, Ryan, in those conversations? And so with me supervising the team, I was able to have a very clear understanding of if this was a decision that I could make or if this was something that fell along the lines of something that was a larger conversation. And so I thought that was helpful as well.
That was helpful for me too, because not all evaluators have a background in also programming. And so with my experiences being on the front line in programming, I also had opinions about certain program features, but it may not have been appropriate for me to share those opinions. And so it was helpful for me at knowing, with my role on this project, where is my feedback beneficial and where is that something that's not really within the scope of my role as well.
That's great. Yes, thank you both for that feedback. I don't see any other questions coming into our question box, so I think we will move on. I just want to say that I hope that all of our participants today really enjoyed the information that was shared and that you will join us for our third and final webinar that is going to tentatively take place in November. But a follow-up email will be going out shortly to all participants with webinar information and a registration link. This webinar is going to focus mostly on a conversation guide for dissemination. So we started with the planning phase, we talked about implementation today, and now we're going to finish up with dissemination. Also, if you enjoyed the information that was shared today, when you received the email to sign up for that third webinar, if you will share that with coworkers, colleagues, friends that you think this information would be helpful or useful for, we would really appreciate that. And lastly, I would like to thank you for attending today. We hope that you did enjoy the information. We will be posting a recording of this webinar as well as supporting tools on the MAST website. So make sure to visit mastresearchcenter.org in the coming weeks and be on the lookout for those resources. You can also access additional briefs and resources at mastresearchcenter.org. I would also like to thank my fellow presenters as well as our practitioner evaluator team. Ryan and Nikita, thank you for sharing your experiences and insights on how you maintain good communication throughout implementation and some of those lessons learned along the way. Lastly, if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint slides from today's presentation, please email myself, Lauren Maddox, or Mindy Herman-Stahl and we will send you a PDF version of these PowerPoint slides. So our emails are listed there on the slide if you would like to request those. Thank you again for attending today's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.